And this one is a cooperative scenario-based campaign game where you're going to be playing through different scenarios, which each might introduce their own variants of rules and also have their own unique setup and goals that players are going to be trying to achieve. And this game is really interesting because it is a bit of a tower defense game as well, because players are going to be making heavy use of traps. In this game, players are going to be trying to defeat enemies in a dungeon, and you can lose the game in a couple ways, either by having those enemies escape the dungeon if they're able to destroy the gate that's holding them in, or if all the characters lose all their health and die. The players will be choosing their own asymmetrical characters with their own sets of stats and strengths and weaknesses, and then each round players are going to be choosing an unexplored path of the dungeon to explore. Whenever you do that, you're going to be going to the associated page in the narrative booklet, and you're going to be reading through that booklet, making different decisions, and possibly different skill checks depending on what the narrative presents, but essentially you're going to be repeating that until you get to the point where you're going to be engaging in battle. Once you get to this phase, you're going to be putting out the associated tile out on the dungeon, and then players are all going to be putting their characters out on that tile and then going into the prep phase, where players will be able to spend or share the resources that they've collected so far in order to do things like upgrade their character, fortify different parts of the dungeon, upgrade their items, or even build traps. And once players are done with their preparations, we're going to be moving into the main phase of the game, which is a turn-based combat phase. You're always going to be starting with the enemy's turn, and you're going to be activating one tile at a time and activating any enemies on that tile. Each enemy is going to have a specific target that they want to go for, possibly a secondary target, but if neither of those are available on that tile, then they're going to be trying to move towards and attack that main gate that's keeping them in the dungeon. And of course, some examples of targets that they might prioritize could be the characters themselves or the traps that players are putting down. But each of the enemies will have their own set of stats and their own range that they can attack, so if any of their preferred targets are within that range, they're going to prioritize that target. But if any of these characters have a special ability, that's going to get activated first. But like I said, if they can't attack anything, then they're just going to be moving closer towards that gate until they're able to attack that. After all the enemies have been activated, you're going to be activating each of the traps that the players were able to set up so far. And the traps are really interesting because they do kind of act like additional teammates, except they can not normally move from the place where you build them. So they do have a little bit more of a tower defense type of style to them. But just like the enemies, each of your traps will have their own set of stats and range that they can attack, and you're just going to be activating each of them one tile at a time, enacting any of their effects and attacking anything within range, and then you're going to be moving on to the players phase. And it's when the players attack that you see the most variety in combat, because each of the players can have all sorts of different specialties as well as different items and upgrades that you can find throughout the game. But each player is also going to have their own player board that has 2 rows of actions, and you're going to have to choose one action from each row every time it's your turn. But then each player also has 2 ultimate abilities that can each be used in addition to the actions that they perform on their turn, but each ultimate ability can only be performed once per round. And the way that players are going to be performing their action is that in the first phase, you can choose any action from the top row and then any action from the bottom row, and you can perform both those actions. But then you're going to be putting a token on whichever actions you chose, and on a following turn, you have to choose a different action. So you're always taking at least 2 actions on your turn, but you're always moving that token to a new location on your action board, meaning that you will want to think about which actions you perform, because whichever action you perform this turn won't be available on the following turn. But there is still just a little more that players can do, because if players have any items equipped or available to them, they can also tap that item in order to use it. Some items might be one-time use, while others will allow you to use them again, but in order to use it again, it will have to be refreshed. And the round continues like this, cycling between the enemies phase, the trap phase, and then the characters phase, until either all the enemies are defeated, and at that place you'll be starting a new round by choosing another path to go into the dungeon, or if the characters are defeated, you would lose that scenario and you'd have to restart. But when the players do succeed into moving into the following round, they'll also get to refresh one of their ultimate abilities as well as any of their items that were previously tapped. And the game continues like this over the 3 rounds, and at the end of the 3rd round, if the players were successful, then you would have completed that scenario, opening up the next scenario in the campaign. And one thing to note about the combat in this game is that it does involve very little randomness. Any dice that you saw in any of these pictures are only used for tracking health or different stats. You don't actually roll dice in any of the combat normally. For the most part, the entire game, and the combat especially, is very focused on the player's decisions and is very deterministic depending on the decisions that you make. And if that sounds interesting to you, you can check this one out, and I have it linked in the description below.